Officer humiliates black teen in handcuffs in court. Seconds later, he freezes when his father walks in. The autumn wind whipping through Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn carried the bitter chill of November, sweeping dead leaves across the pavement. But 17-year-old David Ellison barely felt it. He was sitting quietly on the cold concrete steps of the iconic Brooklyn Public Library, a thick AP United States history textbook resting heavily on his knees. He was waiting for his tutor, minding his own business under the amber glow of a street lamp. David was a quiet kid with a spotless record, a 3.9 GPA, and burning dreams of attending Georgetown Law. He was currently reading a chapter on the 14th Amendment and equal protection under the law. He wore a simple grey hoodie, faded jeans, and scuffed sneakers, standard unremarkable attire for a teenager on a Tuesday evening. But to Officer Derek Jenkins of the NYPD's 78th Precinct, David wasn't a student, he was a target. Jenkins had been patrolling the perimeter of the plaza in his Ford Police Interceptor, the heater blasting as his mood simmered. He had been soured by a recent humiliating reprimand from his desk jockey sergeant over his dismal arrest numbers and civilian complaints. Jenkins was a man who viewed the badge not as a shield to protect the public, but as a heavy iron crown for himself. He thrived on the cheap high of intimidation. As he cruised past the sweeping architecture of the library, his eyes locked onto David's solitary figure. Jenkins didn't see a kid studying. His deeply ingrained implicit biases immediately painted a picture of a loiterer, a suspect casing the area, a problem waiting to be solved. The cruiser's heavy tires screeched slightly as Jenkins abruptly pulled up to the curb, flashing his secondary lights to blind the teenager. He stepped out into the biting wind, adjusting his duty belt, the heavy black leather creaking like a saddle. He approached David with the predatory wide-stanced swagger of a man who firmly believed the law bowed to his every whim. "Hey, you!" Jenkins barked, his voice slicing through the wind as he pointed a thick, calloused finger at the boy. "What are you doing here?" David looked up, blinking rapidly in the harsh, blinding glare of the cruiser's spotlight. He carefully kept his hands visible. "Just studying, officer. Waiting for my tutor to arrive." "Studying," Jenkins mocked, a cruel, disbelieving smirk twisting his lips. He snatched the heavy AP textbook right out of David's hands, flipping carelessly through the thin pages before letting it drop to the concrete with a loud smack. The spine cracked. "Looks like loitering to me. Stand up, hands on the wall." David's heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against his ribs. His father had taught him exactly how to handle these terrifying street encounters. Keep your hands visible. Speak clearly. Do not argue on the dark street. You fight them in the brightly lit courtroom. "Officer, with respect, I haven't done anything wrong," David said, keeping his voice remarkably steady as he slowly stood up, raising his hands shoulder high. "Under the Fourth Amendment and Terry versus Ohio, you need articulable, reasonable suspicion to stop and frisk me." The mention of case law from a teenager in a hoodie was like throwing a lit match into a puddle of gasoline. Jenkins' broad face flushed a deep, violent crimson. The thick veins in his neck bulged against his collar. "You want to play lawyer with me, you little punk?" Jenkins snarled, his spit flying into the cold air. Without warning, he lunged forward. He grabbed David by the thick collar of his hoodie, lifting the boy off his toes, and violently shoved him against the rough stone wall of the library. The impact was brutal. It knocked the breath entirely out of David's lungs, leaving him gasping like a landed fish. Before he could even attempt to recover his footing, Jenkins brutally kicked David's legs apart and slammed the side of his face against the freezing, unforgiving stone. The cold steel of handcuffs bit ruthlessly into David's wrists. Jenkins ratcheted them far too tight, ensuring the metal dug past the skin and into the bone. "Stop resisting!" Jenkins yelled at the top of his lungs, purely for the benefit of the few terrified pedestrians who had stopped on the sidewalk to watch the horror unfold. David wasn't resisting at all. His body was entirely limp, complying completely with the horrific, unprovoked assault. "I'm not resisting," David gasped, the metallic taste of blood pooling in his mouth from where his lower lip had split open against the stone architecture. "You are now," Jenkins whispered maliciously directly into the boy's ear, a sadistic thrill in his voice. He hauled David back up by the chain of the cuffs, the metal slicing deeply into the teenager's skin. "Let's see how smart you are in a 6x8 cell, boy." The holding cell at the 78th precinct was a sensory nightmare. It smelled overwhelmingly of stale urine, industrial bleach, and generations of human despair. David sat rigidly on the freezing steel bench, his hands still cuffed tightly behind his back. Jenkins had spitefully bypassed the mandatory standard procedure of swapping them for front cuffs in the holding area, deliberately violating a dozen strict protocols laid out in the NYPD patrol guide. For 6 agonizing hours, David sat in absolute silence. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a headache-inducing hum. His wrists were bruised purple and bleeding, the metal digging viciously into his ulnar nerves, making his fingers completely numb. He had politely asked for his phone to make his legally mandated phone call. Jenkins had simply laughed from the other side of the bars, casually tossing the iPhone into a plastic evidence bag and throwing it onto a distant, cluttered desk, where David couldn't reach it. "You don't get a call until I say you get a call," Jenkins had sneered, taking a bite of a deli sandwich while watching the boy suffer. "Nobody's coming for you anyway. Kids like you, your daddies are never in the picture. Probably don't even know his name, do you?" David kept his eyes fixed firmly on the cracked linoleum floor, refusing to give the corrupt cop the satisfaction of seeing him break. He bit his injured tongue so hard he tasted copper again. Jenkins had absolutely no idea. He had no idea who David was, because David's identification was tucked inside his backpack, which Jenkins had maliciously misplaced in the trunk of his cruiser instead of properly logging it into the precinct's property clerk system. David had strategically only given his first name and his biological mother's maiden name to the intake desk. He knew the protocol. He wanted to avoid creating a massive, explosive political incident before he could speak to a qualified attorney. But an attorney was already in the building. And she was a nightmare for corrupt cops. Rebecca Sloan was a force of nature. A high-powered, fiercely intelligent criminal defense attorney known throughout the 5 boroughs as the Iron Maiden of Kings County. With her sharp, tailored charcoal suit, immaculate bob, and a piercing gaze that could melt steel, she was a woman who terrified lazy prosecutors and crooked cops alike. She happened to be at the 78th precinct that night, aggressively negotiating a late-night surrender for a high-profile corporate client. As she marched past the holding cells toward the exit, the rhythmic clicking of her heels echoing off the tile, her sharp eyes caught sight of David's huddled form. She stopped dead in her tracks. She recognized him instantly, not as a criminal, but as the bright, incredibly polite teenager who had served her coffee at a police athletic charity gala 6 months prior. Rebecca narrowed her eyes, stepping closer to the bars. She immediately spotted the unnecessarily tight handcuffs, the boy's bleeding lip, and the swelling on his cheekbone. She pivoted on her designer heels, her posture straightening into a terrifying spear of authority, and marched straight to the elevated desk sergeant. "Sergeant Miller," Rebecca's voice sliced through the chaotic, noisy din of the precinct like a surgical scalpel. "Why is that minor in cell 3 still rear-cuffed after intake? And why hasn't he been processed for a phone call? You are in direct, flagrant violation of Section 208-03 of the Patrol Guide, and I will gladly have your shield for it." The sergeant looked up from his paperwork, his face paling slightly as he recognized the fearsome attorney. "Counselor Sloan. Officer Jenkins brought him in. Said he was highly combative, resisting arrest on the street. That boy weighs 140 pounds soaking wet and has the general demeanor of a golden retriever," Rebecca snapped, slamming her heavy leather briefcase onto the high desk with a resounding crack. "I am stepping in as his legal counsel, effective immediately. Get those cuffs off him this second, get me his charging sheet and point me to Jenkins now. Within 10 frantic minutes, Rebecca was sitting across from David in a cramped, windowless, soundproof interrogation room. The handcuffs were finally off, revealing deep, angry red gashes and swelling on the boy's wrists. She gently pushed a cup of water across the metal table. "David," Rebecca said softly, her aggressive, intimidating demeanor softening entirely. "What happened out there?" David explained everything in chronological order. The library steps, the history textbook, the unwarranted stop, the sudden assault, and the taunts in the cell. He spoke clearly, maintaining his composure despite the lingering trauma. "Did you tell them who your father is?" Rebecca asked, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "No," David said quietly, rubbing his wrists. "Dad always said, if a bad cop is actively looking for a reason to hurt you, dropping his name on a dark street won't save you. It might just make them desperate and dangerous. I wanted to wait until we were in court, in the light, where there are records." A slow, incredibly dangerous smile spread across Rebecca Sloane's face. It was the smile of an apex predator who had just spotted a severely wounded gazelle wandering into her territory. "Oh, David," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with righteous, absolute fury. "We are going to give Officer Jenkins the brightest, most blinding light he has ever seen in his miserable life." The next morning, the air in Part AR2 of the Kings County Criminal Court was thick with the distinct smell of cheap floor wax, stale coffee, and the nervous sweat of a dozen defendants waiting for their numbers to be called. Judge Hawthorne, a no-nonsense, deeply cynical jurist with a notoriously low tolerance for police misconduct, presided over the high bench, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Officer Jenkins stood near the prosecutor's table, his chest puffed out like a proud rooster, an arrogant, self-satisfied smirk plastered on his face. He was in his Class A uniform, brass buttons polished to a mirror shine, looking every bit the pristine, untouchable lawman. He was chatting amiably with a court officer ready to bury another street kid under a mountain of carefully fabricated charges. David was led into the courtroom through the secure side door. He was no longer in his bloodied hoodie. Rebecca had arranged for a clean, perfectly pressed navy suit to be delivered to central booking. He looked exactly like what he was, a smart, respectable young man preparing for college. But he was still wearing handcuffs, heavily chained to a thick leather belly chain. Standard, humiliating procedure for the transport until the judge explicitly ordered them removed. The chains rattled loudly with every step he took. The assistant district attorney, an overworked, chronically tired man named Torres, stood up and read the formal charges into the official record. "Your Honor, the state charges the defendant with assault in the second degree on a police officer, a Class D felony, resisting arrest, and obstruction of governmental administration. Given the violent nature of the alleged assault on an officer, the state requests bail be set at $50,000. A shocked murmur rippled through the gallery of spectators. $50,000 for a teenager with absolutely no prior record was an astronomical, punitive figure. Rebecca Sloane rose smoothly from the defense table, adjusting her glasses with calculated precision. "Your Honor, these charges are a work of fiction so egregious, so poorly constructed, that it belongs in the fantasy section of the exact library my client was violently abducted from. We request an immediate preliminary hearing right now on the record. Let Officer Jenkins take the stand and swear under penalty of perjury to this fantasy." Judge Hawthorne looked intrigued, peering over his glasses. Preliminary hearings at a basic arraignment were exceedingly rare, but Rebecca Sloane didn't ask for unusual things without a fully loaded gun hidden in her pocket. "Officer Jenkins," the judge rumbled, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "Take the stand." Jenkins strutted to the witness box, practically vibrating with confidence. He placed his heavy hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. He sat down, adjusting his microphone with agonizing, theatrical slowness, making sure the gallery got a good look at him. Ada Torres guided him through the initial practiced testimony. Jenkins spun a masterful, seamless web of lies. He claimed David was pacing aggressively in the dark, shouting gang slogans to unseen accomplices, and aggressively reaching repeatedly into his waistband, where a weapon could be concealed. When I approached to conduct a lawful Terry stop for my own safety, Jenkins lied smoothly, looking directly and earnestly at the empty jury box. The defendant lunged at me like a wild animal. He struck me hard in the chest and attempted to flee into the plaza. I had to use necessary, department-approved force to subdue him to protect myself and the innocent public. Torres nodded, making a note on his legal pad. Thank you, officer. The state has no further questions at this time. Jenkins leaned back comfortably in the wooden witness chair, looking down at David with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. He had won. He always won these interactions. These kids had no voice, no power, no political resources. They were just ghosts in the massive machine of the justice system. Defense, Judge Hawthorne said, gesturing with a pen. Your witness. Let's make it quick. Rebecca Sloane stood up. She didn't walk to the standard wooden podium. Instead, she walked directly toward the witness box, her designer heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor. The terrifying sound of a ticking time bomb counting down to 0. Officer Jenkins, Rebecca began, her voice dangerously calm, devoid of any expected courtroom theatrics. You testified a moment ago that my client was shouting gang slogans. Can you please repeat just one of those specific slogans for the court record? Jenkins hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting to the ADA. I couldn't make out the exact words, Counselor. It was the tone. Aggressive, threatening, anti-police rhetoric. Ah, the tone. Rebecca nodded slowly, feigning understanding. And you said he reached for his waistband. After you aggressively detained him, did you recover a weapon? A gun? A knife? A sharp piece of plastic? No, Jenkins admitted, his jaw tightening as he sensed a trap forming. But under the circumstances, in the dark, under the circumstances of him holding a massive Advanced Placement United States history textbook, Rebecca interrupted, her voice cracking like a sudden whip. Is it your professional, sworn opinion that an AP history textbook is a deadly weapon, officer? A few stifled snickers erupted from the crowded gallery. Judge Hawthorne banged his wooden gavel lightly, though a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Jenkins flushed an angry red. He was holding the large book to deliberately conceal his waistline. It's a common tactic used by seasoned thugs on the street to hide contraband. Thugs, Rebecca repeated the loaded word, letting it hang suspended in the stale courtroom air for maximum impact. That's a very interesting choice of words, officer. You seem to have made a tremendous amount of assumptions about my client in a matter of mere seconds. In fact, while he was detained in the holding cell, bleeding from the face, didn't you brutally mock him? Didn't you explicitly tell him that kids like him never have fathers around to teach them respect? The ADA shot up from his chair. Objection. Relevance. This is highly inflammatory and prejudicial, Your Honor. Goes directly to the officer's state of mind, inherent bias, and credibility as a witness, Your Honor, Rebecca countered instantly, not breaking eye contact with Jenkins. Overruled, Hawthorne grunted, leaning forward and steepling his fingers. Answer the question, Officer Jenkins. Jenkins gripped the wooden edges of the witness stand so hard, his knuckles turned white. His polished arrogance was starting to fray rapidly, replaced by a defensive, hot-headed anger. I might have said something to that general effect. It's the harsh reality of the streets, Counselor. You wouldn't know. These kids grow up with absolutely no discipline, no strong male role models in the house. They run wild. Someone has to step up and teach them respect. Someone has to show them that actions have consequences. Jenkins looked around the room, expecting nods of quiet agreement from the court bailiffs and other officers. He felt completely untouchable. He was a cop in uniform, His word was gospel against a teenager in chains. "I stand absolutely by what I said. The kid is a punk. He has no guidance. He's exactly the kind of statistic we deal with every single day on patrol." Rebecca Sloan didn't get angry. She didn't yell. Instead, she smiled. It was a terrifying, bone-chilling smile that made Ada Torres suddenly very nervous. She looked down at her blank legal pad, then slowly back up at Jenkins. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Officer Jenkins," Rebecca said, her voice dropping to a theatrical, crystal-clear whisper that carried perfectly across the dead silent room. "A father's guidance is incredibly crucial. It teaches a young man how to handle severe adversity, how to handle systemic corruption, how to handle bullies with badges." Rebecca turned dramatically to face the heavy, brass-handled oak double doors at the very back of the courtroom. "Your Honor," Rebecca said, her voice suddenly booming with immense authority, "Officer Jenkins has made my client's upbringing and alleged lack of paternal presence a central focal point of his justification for this brutal, unconstitutional arrest. Therefore, the defense would like to introduce a late arrival to the gallery. Someone who takes a very great, very personal interest in exactly how the NYPD teaches respect." Jenkins rolled his eyes, sighing into the microphone. He assumed it was some naive social worker, or maybe a neighborhood pastor in a cheap suit coming to beg for leniency. "Bailiff," Rebecca commanded, pointing to the back, "please open the doors." The heavy brass handles of the oak doors turned simultaneously. The massive doors swung slowly inward, pulled open by two uniformed court officers who took one look into the hallway and immediately snapped to rigid military-style attention, their hands plastered tight against the seams of their trousers. The bustling courtroom fell into an eerie, suffocating, absolute silence. Not a single cough or rustle of paper could be heard. Through the doorway walked a man who seemed to pull the entire gravity of the large room directly toward him. He was tall, incredibly broad-shouldered, with a distinguished touch of silver at his temples. He was dressed not in a civilian suit, but in the impeccably tailored Class A dress uniform of the New York City Police Department. But it wasn't just any uniform. It was the uniform of a king. The thick gold braiding on the visor of his hat gleamed brilliantly under the harsh fluorescent lights. The breast of his dark jacket was covered in rows of colorful commendation ribbons, speaking to 3 decades of valor, bloodshed, and impeccable, legendary service to the city. But it was the collar that instantly drew every single eye in the room. Pinned to each side of his sharp collar were 4 solid, gleaming gold stars. It was Marcus Ellison, the police commissioner of the city of New York, the absolute highest-ranking official in the largest police force in the United States, the man who personally commanded 35,000 heavily armed officers, the man who held the pension, career, and freedom of every single cop in the city in his bare hands. Commissioner Ellison didn't march. He walked down the center aisle with a slow, measured, terrifyingly calm stride. The air in the courtroom literally seemed to drop 10 degrees. Every single police officer in the room, from the bailiffs to the ADA's assigned detectives in the back row, immediately scrambled to their feet, their spines snapping straight as steel rods. Up on the elevated witness stand, Officer Jenkins' brain completely short-circuited. He stared wide-eyed at the commissioner. Then his panicked eyes darted to the teenager sitting quietly at the defense table. He looked at the boy's face. He really looked at it this time. The strong jawline, the exact shape of the dark eyes, the quiet, unyielding dignity that he had mistaken for insolence. Ellison, the boy at the precinct, had only given his first name to Jenkins, and the intake desk had processed him under the last name of his biological mother to avoid a media circus, strictly per department protocol, until an attorney arrived. David Ellison. The blood drained entirely from Jenkins' face in a rush, leaving his skin a ghastly translucent grey. His stomach plummeted violently into his heavy duty boots, replaced by a massive block of solid ice. The sensitive microphone in front of him loudly broadcasted the sudden, ragged, desperate hitch in his breathing. His thick hands, which had been gripping the wooden rail in arrogant defiance just seconds ago, began to shake so violently they rattled against the wood. He froze. Literally, physically, completely froze. His mouth opened slightly, but his vocal cords were paralyzed. The swagger, the racist bravado, the absolute illusion of unlimited power, it all evaporated into thin air in a microsecond, leaving behind nothing but raw, primal, inescapable terror. He had just beaten, framed, and publicly humiliated the beloved, brilliant son of the police commissioner of New York City. Commissioner Ellison continued walking down the center aisle, the sound of his polished shoes echoing. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the ADA. He stopped right at the wooden swinging gate separating the gallery from the well of the court. He looked directly up at Officer Jenkins on the stand. Ellison's eyes were like black ice. There was no screaming. There was no theatrical arm-waving rage. There was only a cold, silent, absolutely terrifying promise of total destruction. "Good morning, Commissioner," Rebecca Sloan said smoothly, breaking the deafening, suffocating silence of the room. "Good morning, Counselor," Ellison replied, his voice a deep, resonant, booming baritone that made Jenkins physically flinch as if he'd been struck with a baton. Ellison unlatched the wooden gate, walked gracefully to the defense table, and placed a large, heavy, immensely reassuring hand on David's shoulder. "Are you all right, son?" the commissioner asked softly, his eyes scanning the bruising on his boy's face. David looked up at his father, the residual fear from the night entirely leaving his eyes. "I am now, Dad." Judge Hawthorne, a man who had seen decades of wild courtroom drama, leaned far back in his high leather chair, a look of profound, almost gleeful realization washing over his weathered face. He looked at the violently trembling, sweating officer on the stand, then at the towering commissioner, before finally looking at the defense attorney. "Counselor Sloan," Judge Hawthorne said gently, a hint of amusement in his tone. "Do you have further questions for this witness?" "Just one, Your Honor," Rebecca said, turning her predatory, unblinking gaze back to the terrified cop. "Officer Jenkins, earlier you testified under oath that my client aggressively lunged at you in the dark, necessitating the violent use of force. Do you wish to immediately amend that sworn statement before I submit Defense Exhibit A into the official evidence record?" Jenkins swallowed hard, the sound audible through the mic. His throat was completely bone dry. I, he stammered, unable to form a coherent thought. Rebecca didn't wait for him to find his voice. She pulled a small silver flash drive from her jacket pocket and handed it to the stunned court clerk. "Your Honor, the defense submits into evidence the Axon Body 3 camera footage from Officer Jenkins's own tactical vest. The officer manually turned his camera off completely before the assault began, incorrectly assuming there would be no record of his brutality." Jenkins closed his eyes tightly. A wave of intense nausea hit him. He gripped the edge of the desk to keep from passing out. "However," Rebecca continued, her voice ringing with absolute triumph, "Officer Jenkins is apparently unaware of the recent mandatory firmware update to all NYPD Axon systems, pushed personally by Commissioner Ellison's office last month. The cameras now feature a highly advanced 2-minute pre-event buffer. Even when the device is manually powered down by an officer, the system securely retains the previous 120 seconds of high-definition video and audio in the secure police cloud." She aimed a remote at the wall and pressed a button. The large flat-screen television mounted above the jury box flickered to life. The video was agonizingly, crystal clear. It showed David sitting peacefully on the library steps, immersed in his book. It captured Jenkins's highly aggressive, swaggering approach. It captured the exact, mocking dialogue. Jenkins insulting the boy's intelligence and grabbing his book. And then, horrifyingly clear for the entire court to see, it showed Jenkins lunging forward, completely unprovoked, grabbing the compliant boy by the throat and violently slamming his face into the stone wall. It showed David going completely limp, offering absolute zero resistance, while Jenkins cruelly ratcheted the steel handcuffs, with clear, malicious intent. The video ended, leaving a frozen frame of Jenkins' enraged face. The silence in the courtroom was thicker and heavier than before. Ada Torres stood up immediately, his face pale with utter disgust and professional horror. He looked at the frozen video, then at Jenkins, with pure revulsion. "Your Honor." The people moved to immediately dismiss all charges against the defendant. With extreme prejudice, the state refuses to prosecute this fiction. "Granted," Judge Hawthorne said, slamming his wooden gavel down with explosive final force. "Mr. Ellison, you are completely exonerated of all charges. Bailiff, get those damn chains and handcuffs off that young man immediately." The court officer rushed forward, eagerly unlocking the heavy padlock and belly chains. David rubbed his raw, bleeding wrists with a deep sigh of relief. "As for you, Officer Jenkins," Judge Hawthorne's voice dripped with raw venom as he pointed his pen at the stand, "I am officially referring this matter to the District Attorney's Public Integrity Bureau for immediate prosecution. Furthermore, I am finding you in direct, blatant contempt of court for aggravated perjury. Do not leave this building." Before Jenkins could even process the reality of his looming prison sentence, Commissioner Ellison finally spoke. He stepped away from his son's side and walked slowly, deliberately, toward the witness box until he was inches away from the railing. "Jenkins," the commissioner said, quietly, the words sounding like a death sentence. Jenkins couldn't bring himself to look his boss in the eye. He stared blankly at the brass railing, his chest heaving with panic. "Commissioner, I didn't know he was your—" "That is exactly the problem," Ellison interrupted, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. "You didn't know. You thought he was just a random kid you could break for fun. You thought he was a nobody with no voice. You proudly wear the shield of this city, and you use it as a weapon to terrorize the very people you swore an oath to protect." Ellison reached slowly into his dark jacket pocket. "You talked a lot about teaching him a lesson last night. About teaching him consequences." The commissioner turned his head slightly toward the back of the room and gave a single sharp nod. The heavy oak doors swung violently open a second time. Two large men in sharp black suits, wearing earpieces and with NYPD Internal Affairs Bureau gold badges hung prominently around their necks, walked swiftly and purposefully down the center aisle. "Derek Jenkins," the lead IAB detective said, his voice devoid of any emotion, as he aggressively pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for felony assault under color of law, aggravated perjury, civil rights violations, and falsifying business records. Stand up and turn around." Jenkins' legs completely gave out beneath him. He stumbled heavily as he tried to stand, his knees buckling, practically falling out of the elevated witness box. The two IAB detectives caught him roughly by the arms, spinning him around with professional efficiency. The loud, metallic click, click, click of the handcuffs ratcheting tight, echoing in the vast courtroom, was the sweetest, most satisfying sound David had ever heard in his life. It was poetic justice. They were the exact same pair of cuffs Jenkins had sadistically used on David the night before, seized directly from Jenkins' belt as core evidence. As Jenkins was frog-marched down the center aisle, completely humiliated, stripped of his badge, and exposed to the world as a fraud, he looked back over his shoulder one last time. He saw the towering Commissioner Ellison wrapping his strong arms securely around his teenage son in a tight, immensely protective embrace. He saw the brilliant Rebecca Sloan calmly packing her leather briefcase, a highly satisfied, victorious smirk on her face. And he saw Judge Hawthorne glaring down at him with absolute, unfiltered disgust. Jenkins was forcefully dragged out the doors, the heavy oak slamming shut behind him with a loud boom, forever sealing his fate. He would soon face massive federal civil rights charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 242. He would lose his precious pension, his freedom, and every ounce of his pride. He would spend years in a federal penitentiary, known to the inmates simply as a disgraced, crooked cop who picked on the absolute wrong kid. Back in the warm safety of the courtroom, Commissioner Ellison pulled back from the hug and carefully examined his son's bruised, swollen wrists. His jaw tightened in anger at the sight, but he forced a proud, loving smile for his boy. "You did good, David," his father whispered, patting his back. "You kept your head under extreme pressure. You fought him exactly where it counts." In the light, David looked up at the towering, legendary figure of his father, then glanced over at Rebecca Sloane, who gave him a sharp, highly respectful nod of approval. "I learned from the absolute best, Dad." David smiled, the throbbing pain in his split lip and battered wrists entirely forgotten in the overwhelming glow of victory. Justice in the city was often famously blind, and sometimes it was brutally, painfully slow.